The problem, or a major problem, with what is called assisted dying, whether that's euthanasia or assisted suicide, is wherever it's legalized, it expands. And what you vote for, what passes as a law, never stays still, but it increases and increases to affect more people and to endanger more people. So if we're thinking to change the law on assisted suicide or euthanasia, we really need to look at what has happened in other countries which have done so. We need to look before we leap, and where we need to look to are those countries which have changed the law. There are different models that they might use. There's one model which you have in the Netherlands and Belgium, and to an extent in Canada, which is euthanasia, where a doctor might give lethal injection to someone. And then there's a model that you have in Switzerland, where the doctor doesn't do it, people do it themselves, but it's not very medical. It's really a bit of a free-for-all. And you have organizations like Dignitas or Exit, which provide this as a service, but they're not really connected to the health service as such. And then you have a model that you have in Oregon, where it's aimed at people who have a terminal illness, so it's more restricted, and again is restricted to people who self-administer, who it's for assisted suicide, it's not euthanasia. So those are basically the three models which are out there. It exists in perhaps a dozen or so countries worldwide, so not in most countries. And some of those countries, it's only very recent, so we don't have a lot of evidence from different places, but we do have evidence, and all of the evidence suggests that once you start it, then you start down a particular road. And it's very difficult to restrict it just to one form, and in particular it's very difficult to restrict it only to assisted suicide, only for people who have, say, 6 months to live, only for people with a terminal illness. That's a model that you have in the United States, but no other country in the world, so I say that again, no other country in the world restricts what is called assisted dying, that is, say, assisted suicide or euthanasia, to people who are terminally ill self-administering, except the United States. Everywhere else, they allow it also for a doctor to do it, or they allow it also for people who are not terminally ill, or for a doctor to do it and for people who are terminally ill, not terminally ill. And sometimes, like in Belgium and Canada, also for people with mental illness. In the Belgium and the Netherlands and Colombia, also for children. And sometimes, as in the Netherlands, for someone who hasn't got the capacity at the time to consent, but previously wrote that they would want this. They have an advanced euthanasia decision. And what this means in practice is that somebody might have to be restrained, held down, and have a lethal injection. And that is called voluntary euthanasia. They're talking about it in Belgium, and they're talking about it in Quebec, in Canada. That's kind of the direction of travel. Sometimes people say, oh, we can just restrict it to people with a terminal illness. And if we say that in our law, then it won't expand. But in Canada, in 2016, it was only for people whose death was reasonably foreseeable. But by 2021, it had expanded, and it's now for people with chronic illness. And in Colombia, in 2016, it was only for people in the terminal phase. But again, in 2021, it was expanded for people with chronic illness, for people who might have years to live and are not dying, but are suffering with a chronic illness or a disability. And if you think about it, if the aim is to relieve suffering, Why are you only concerned about suffering at the end of life, not for people who are going to suffer longer? Why are you only concerned about the suffering of adults and not the suffering of children? Why are you only concerned about the suffering of people with physical illness and not the suffering of people with mental illness? If this becomes the solution, the ultimate solution, the final solution to any kind of suffering that we can't treat very well with medicine, then it will expand and expand. And that's what we have seen. That's what we see in various different countries. Australia is at the moment being put forward as a good example, as an example we might like to follow. But Australia, which has still only 5 years of data, only 5 years of experience, the law in Victoria was passed in 2017. It came into force in 2019. We've seen a gradual expansion from between the different states. So in Victoria, it was for people who had 6 months to live, but an exception was made for people with certain sort of diseases, with neurodegenerative diseases. And it said, well, for those it could be 12 months, so 6 months, but 12 months for certain diseases. And then in Queensland, it should be, oh, why not have 12 months for everyone? Why just say it's just for some? So they expanded it for 12 months for everyone. And then in the Australian Capital Territory, they say, well, why talk about months at all? For people with more than 12 months, they might still be dying. And so they said, well, it's for people who are declining and they are at the end of life, but without saying what that might mean, but except explicitly that it doesn't mean 12 months. Doesn't necessarily mean 12 months. But that's where they started in Canada in 2016 with this kind of, we have to be dying, but well, let's not put a number on it. And if you think that, why not expand it? So what you see all the time is this expansion and expansion. Something which is put forward as for a very small category of people, only for people who really are imminently dying, and with various kind of strictures. What happens is once you allow that, then the rationale for that will push, and it'll push, and you won't be there to close the door. You might open the door, but it'll be the people in 5 years' time or 10 years' time who will push it open further and push it open further. And that's what we see. That's what you can see it in Canada happening. You can see it in Australia happening. You can see it in Netherlands. You can see it in Belgium. You can see it in Colombia. These are not isolated examples. They're different from one another. The different models are bad in different ways. In Anna Karenina, it says every happy family is happy in the same way, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Things can go wrong in different kinds of ways. So some of the ways in which you have assisted suicide cause one set of problems, but if you try to correct those, you then find you get a different set of problems. So, for example, in Australia or in the United States, it's assisted suicide. They're given a poison, which they go away and put in a cupboard somewhere, and then they take or they don't take later. Now, the advantage of that is that they don't feel any pressure to take it. The disadvantage is you have poison in the cupboard. So it happened in Australia just last year, I think it was, that there was a woman who was dying with cancer. She applied for voluntary assisted dying. They gave her this lethal drug, which she kept. But then she changed her mind and she said actually she'd like a doctor to do it. But she didn't give the poison back. And then just after she died, her husband, in his grief, took the poison. Why should it surprise us that if you make the means of suicide available, then people and their lives. And you might say, oh, but if you have a doctor there, then that won't happen, because a doctor will make sure, you know, either they take it or they don't. But if you have a doctor there waiting, then it's much more difficult to say no. So again, in Australia or in the United States, about a third of people who have this lethal drug on them, they die before they take it. They never decide to take it. The moment never quite happens. Whereas in Canada, where overwhelmingly it's a doctor who does it, and overwhelmingly it's by lethal injection, 99.9% of cases, you arrange for the doctor to come. The doctor comes. Before the doctor gives the lethal injection, the doctor has to say, are you sure you still want this? And how many people say no then? Less than 1%, because it's difficult to say no. So you set up a situation where it's difficult to say no to the doctor with a lethal injection. So you have problems if you allow a free-for-all. You have problems if you allow the doctor to be involved, because the power relationship between the doctor and the patient is not equal. Each of these models, they have different problems. But what we see in all these different jurisdictions is that the numbers increase, the categories increase, and the cases of abuse increase.